This week on The Futurists, Brett and Rob are back and we're taking on extreme weather. You know, we can talk about the potential for extreme weather with climate, but the biggest problem we're facing right now is that if this trend continues that we're seeing, it's going to be largely unaffordable for people to live in homes or live in cities where infrastructure hasn't been made resilient. And we don't have a coordinated plan for changing that.
Hey, Brett. Hi, good to see you, man.
Hey.
Welcome back to the Futurists.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
It's Rob Tersick and Brett King, and we're bringing you another episode of the Futurists. But this time, we thought we would just go for it together without a guest, because the conversation we've been having is about extreme weather. Man, lately, every time you turn to the newspaper or TV, you see some kind of extreme weather event in some part of the world. And it's always presented in this super vivid, dramatic way that makes it seem like the whole world is on fire or underwater or under a storm or some kind of tornado.
Yeah.
And what we want to do is probe into that a little bit and understand what the implications are for the world that we're moving into. There's no question now, I think everybody sees that anthropological climate change is a reality. The world is changing. The climate systems seem to be changing. And the cause of this is humanity itself. You know, the fossil fuel emissions are largely responsible for this change. What's not so well understood is what the long-term implications of this are. There's a lot of speculation, and sometimes the press takes an idea and explodes it into drama when that's not entirely accurate. So this week, Brett and I wanted to get into that a little bit, unpack it, and understand what is the future of climate? What is the future of weather? Are extreme weather events going to become the norm? So those are some of the topics we wanted to get into.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's like it's not. You could say that part of this is media, is that we have better coverage, live coverage, and lots of people were watching the live hurricane feeds and things like that, I mean, I remember going through a massive typhoon in Hong Kong back in 1999, actually, when I first moved there. Mm-hmm. And it was the first Type 10 or T10 typhoon, which is the highest rating they have. I think that starts at 3.
They turn the cars over, right? They flip cars over.
No, this was insane. It was like glass was being blown off of skyscrapers. Glass windows were being blown off because it was like the airflow of the air was so strong. It was sucking the glass off the frames. It was so very famously Immigration Tower, which was opposite the harbour there, all the immigration records were flying, all the papers were flying everywhere.
That could be convenient for some.
Yeah, but the key thing is that this was something that you saw after the event. Now we're seeing these things happening in real time. We've got satellite tracking data, all of this stuff. So the amount of information we have about this is obviously a lot more significant as well.
Right. That's right. And in the past, you would see the aftermath, which would look bad, but no one was there in the field shooting video of it at the time.
Exactly.
It's funny, when I lived in Hong Kong, I lived through a couple of hurricanes as well. And I remember very clearly downtown, like Queensway, was underwater for 3 days. And I don't know what they did to save the subway system. But also, when I grew up in the Midwest, and we used to have winter storms. It was quite normal for the city to get shut down for 2 days. Like, that was not an unusual occurrence. That was every winter if you lived in the snow belt. We don't really get those kinds of winter storms as much or even ever in some parts of the snow belt anymore. So I guess the point there is that extreme weather has always existed. One of the questions is it more frequent now? Are the storms getting more intense, right? Those are stories. We've heard that reported in the press. And then the other aspect is the politicization of this. So unfortunately, like everything else in the United States, the way we cover weather events has a political aspect to it now as well. Yeah. So whichever part of the political spectrum you're on,
we'll try and stay away.
You're going to get a different interpretation of a weather event. Like right now, there are voices on the Republican Party side that are saying that the president of the United States has the ability to control the weather, which seems absurd on the face of it. But then again, this political season, no statement is too extreme. You can say almost anything and someone will believe it. They're also making accusations that the government's withholding assistance from different regions for political reasons. And again, that's not true, and that's been debunked even by people on both parties.
I saw a
But
great
that
I
adds to
saw
the confusion.
I saw a great TikTok about this. So why didn't Donald Trump control the weather when he was president? You know, if the government has that power, you know. But anyway, we're not going to get into politicization of this. So
But it's a factor, right? Because it affects the way you interpret it. Like literally,
true.
the media that you read is going to dramatize the weather, and then it might even skew your perception based on your political instincts. But so for those reasons, it's a little hard to get to what's actually happening. Now, what I understand, well, here's what I've heard, and this actually was the genesis of this conversation. I had heard two claims. One is that the big storms are more frequent, and then secondly, that the big storms are more intense. And as it turns out, it's not necessarily true that the storms are more frequent. I was surprised to learn that because it sure seems like that. You hear about that.
Yeah.
For instance, we just had two big hurricanes in Florida back to back. That's unusual. But apparently the total number of storms hasn't really changed significantly. On the other hand, because the water is warmer, that means several things. You can have much more intensity in the storm, and the storm itself can hold more water. So that we're getting these tremendous downpours of rain, like tremendous amounts of water dumping on places. Brett, I was just in Montreal, and they got affected by that hurricane, the previous hurricane that came ripping through North Carolina and caused so much damage. It went all the way up to Montreal. I think people don't realize that those storms just continue, and they're so loaded with water that they can flood areas hundreds of miles away from landfall.
So if you look at the top 10 most destructive hurricanes, and this is I guess scored by the National Weather Service in the US, the top deadliest hurricanes in history, only really two of them are modern hurricanes. And that is Hurricane Katrina, which was in 2005, of course, and Hurricane Maria, which was in 2017. The Great Galveston hurricane was the worst. It killed 8,000 people. Some say more than 12,000. But the property damage was estimated at $30 million. What we're looking at for the property damage of the most recent hurricane season is we're talking about at least 200 billion in costs and 100 billion in insurance loss. So the economic impact is certainly much greater these days than the impact in pure number of lives that are lost. We got better at saving people, and also, part of the problem, if you look at hurricanes in the late 1800s or 1930s, for example, is the US didn't have the economic resources. That there was no such thing as FEMA at the time, and so being able to go in and save people who were without power for weeks on end, access to food, roads, and bridges out. Yeah, you're on your own. So we actually, despite all of the politicization about this, we've actually got much better at responding to these extreme weather events.
And we're better at forecasting. And most places that are coastal now have better plans for evacuation. Like, don't forget, lots of people were evacuated from the path of this recent hurricane, Milton, in Florida. So governments have gotten better at anticipating and being prepared for the storms. One other factor, Brett, is building codes have improved. When there was a great devastation in the 19th century, there essentially were no building codes. And frankly, no one had an idea that the storm was coming, and they didn't know how to prepare for it necessarily. Today, building codes continue to get improved, although this is another politicized issue because building codes mean the government's telling people what they can do with their private property, and some people don't like that. It turns out, though, that the new building codes, the houses that are built to the new codes are able to withstand these intense storms much better. That lessens the economic impact, but that's a huge factor. Interesting fact I didn't know. 40% of the U.S. population lives in coastal areas. We're still a very maritime nation. Like, we're very ocean-focused or sea-focused or river-focused,
that's
which means if there's going to be...
Yeah, that's historically the way we built cities, because trade was happening with ships, and so that's why, you have these natural ports and so forth, that formed this sort of network of trade. And we built airports and things and railways later, but ships were what caused the placement of cities, and we built on top of that economic trade. So when you look at the risk from sea level rise, there's actually 570 capital cities that are on the coast. And so I don't know if you remember seeing that clip on the newsroom. That great Aaron Sorkin TV drama where they interviewed the guy supposedly from the EPA talking about the climate risk, and he it was a great line. I memorized it. It's like 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. That's fact number one. Fact number two, humans don't breathe underwater. So, at some point we're going to have to deal with this. And, you can imagine, from purely an economic impact perspective, you can imagine cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou or New York being reinforced, on the coast to combat these flood surges that are happening with these extreme weather events. And sea level rise, which all we're going to need is one of the ice shelves, the Greenland ice shelf or the West Antarctic ice shelf, to either partially collapse or fully collapse, and we're going to see an incredible rise, right? And the economic argument for protecting New York is fairly clear. But, what about other cities? What about Miami? What about, other cities on the east coast of the US? What about other cities globally? What about the Maldives, Bangladesh, Tuvalu, Tonga, et cetera? This is a very different economic proposition.
Question. It's the economics and also the political willpower. I've done a lot of business in Charleston, South Carolina, where the city technically is at sea level. In some places, it's actually below sea level. No surprise, they get flooded routinely. So it's a little bit like Miami, where or Venice in Italy, where it's just kind of seasonal. You expect to get flooded for a while when there's a storm. And there's absolutely no political willpower, it seems to me, in Charleston to do anything about it. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came in with a plan to build a seawall around the entire city to protect it. That would keep it dry. Right now they have a low seawall, but it's a bit of a joke because it's only a couple feet high. So if there's a big wave or surge, it turns into a bathtub. That wall keeps the water in. It's the opposite. It's doing the wrong job. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wanted to build a much taller wall. But, of course, it was designed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, so it looks like the Berlin Wall. It was not very attractive, and that's a beautiful city. And, of course, the people with the nicest houses are right on the edge of the water, and they don't want their view is ruined by a big, ugly concrete wall. So then some other design firms came along and decided to lob in an unsolicited proposal for how to make that wall beautiful. And they proposed earth and berms and a kind of urban park that would be elevated but would serve the same function as keeping the water out. And then that became political, of course, and then as a result, there's political gridlock, and nothing happened. And now, if I was talking to a friend of mine in Charleston, he said, "Oh, I can always tell when there's going to be a big storm and a surge." I said, "How can you tell?" He said, "Because I can notice the way people are parking. His house happens to be in one of the areas that's a little higher, and so neighbors from neighboring streets will park their cars on his street so that their cars stay dry." Right. And so he said he's got like the collective wisdom of his neighbors to tell him when there's going to be a storm with a surge.
Following the crowd.
Like an advanced warning system.
So in terms of the economic cost, this is an area that obviously is getting to the point of significant damage. So if you talk about the $200 billion of damages from the last two hurricanes in just the last few weeks, being able to absorb those types of costs on a continuous basis is a challenge. Between 1980 and 2023, or August 2023, we had $2.6 trillion of damages in the US from weather and climate disasters. So, if you think about this, if these storms are getting more intense, or the economic impact of these storms are getting more intense, then we need a plan just purely on the economic basis of the impact of these events, at least in terms of resilience of infrastructure and so forth.
Yeah, so people turn to government for that kind of leadership. And what government can do is they can respond. That's what our Federal Emergency Management Agency is for. And they do respond. They get criticized no matter what they do, so there's plenty of room for improvement, no doubt. And they do deploy funds to disaster-struck areas. But the other way to handle it is locally with building codes. And actually, this is an area of some progress. You're starting to see new building codes Again, it's haphazard and it's not always enforced, and there's always local resistance to it because it does drive up the cost of building a home. It turns out, Brett, that in Florida, if you adopt the new building codes, your house would be 16 feet above sea level, which is high. And it would have special kinds of glass and other kinds of reinforcement. But if you build to those codes, your house will be more or less resilient, and it'll certainly survive the storm better. The problem is for existing homes, not
Yes.
new building. So for existing homes, the retrofit is extremely expensive, and homeowners don't want to make that investment. For new buildings, it adds 15%, which is not nothing. But on the other hand, you're going to have a stormproof home. There are even homes now that have like stormproof windows and so forth, so they can really withstand these storms better. So we have a way to mitigate the risk. What's lacking, I think, is the willpower or the for individuals, the willingness to spend the money in advance. And many people are willing to take the risk.
But this is a problem for many areas of the US economy. I mean, we've talked about this before, but China deployed 250 gigawatts of solar energy last year. So, and you'll hear people argue, yeah, but they're doing that because of the air quality in China and yada, yada, yada. But let's put it in context. The US has done about 100 gigawatts over the last 50 years for solar, and China did 2.5 times that in 1 year, 50% of, the solar that was deployed. Now, solar panels or solar farms are, have to be resilient to climate and extreme weather as well. They're made out of glass and so forth. So impacts on this can be an issue. You also have to have the issue of battery storage to make solar work in the evenings when the sun isn't working. But if you look at resilience of infrastructure, I see a lot more investment in replacing bridges and building and replacing roads, telecoms infrastructure, energy infrastructure in places like China than I see in the US or Australia, for example, where you've had multiple grid failures over the last few years because we've underinvested in renewables in those areas.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think, first of all, there's a lot of built infrastructure. So we're talking about retrofitting in the Western and industrialized nations, where China, in many cases, it's a green field, so they can build to new codes and they can account for those extra costs in that construction. Second, they don't have to ask anyone's permission. We have a NIMBY private problem here, and then third, at least speaking for the U.S., but I think this is probably true in Australia to some degree as well. People don't like the government telling them what to do, right? So if you own a home, the typical American homeowner is going to be resistant to any mandate to upgrade or to fix or to do anything. Even here in California, where I'm on the hillside, so I have to do hillside clearance every year in the spring to prevent fires. Well, that seems like an eminently practical thing. I actually welcome it when they remind me to do it so that I make sure it gets done. I do notice my neighbors doing it because I'm on a hill. I could see them, removing the brush and stuff so that we don't have fires here. But it only takes one or two people to be resistant to that to create a problem, right? And so what we don't have in the States is a great method of collective action. We can't enforce it. People would resist that, where I think in other countries, the government can simply mandate it and it has to be done. We don't have a great mechanism. So this is one of the weaknesses of the kind of democracy we have.
Yeah, I think the same is true of Australia, in that respect. And I think if you look at how we're going to have to act to be able to make infrastructure resilient and survive more extreme weather events in the future, if that is going to be the status quo, it is going to require consensus building. And, I do, we've talked about this on the show many times, but I keep coming back to this theme when I'm talking with people about this, is adaptability to these changes, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's climate, whether it's food production and food security, because we now see, like last year, reportedly 130 million eco-refugees, mainly driven by food security issues. Whenever you look at any of those issues, it really requires consensus building to be able to make the changes in society, for resilience. And that's a problem that it's getting harder to do that in places like Australia and the US.
Well, and I don't think it's a skill government's great at. Even it's a criticism levied against the Democratic Party that they're managed by elites who don't have they kind of have a tin ear when it comes to talking to regular people. But I think it could be broadly said for politicians across the spectrum that they don't have a great facility for getting the collective input from their voters, from their constituents. We don't have a good mechanism for that. As you know, I worked on digital twins for cities for a number of years, and I was looking at cities that are low-lying coastal cities as a great place to get collective action with a digital twin. The idea is to create a visualization so you can show what the city looks like, and then you can say, okay, show me an extreme storm, show me a force 10 hurricane. What would happen? And you could see the model, and then you can say, okay, now show me that same model if we put seawalls in place or if we put some other mitigation in place, and people could see the impact on their property. And I think that tool would be a great way to galvanize consensus in a city to get people to actually see what would happen to the stuff that they own, and maybe that would get them to be a little bit more supportive of these initiatives. The problem is that usually government comes in and they're like, well, we hired a bunch of experts. Here's what the experts tell us. Therefore, we recommend this expensive proposition that you might not like, and it feels very top down. And that is, these days, at least in the U.S., those are fighting words. At that point, you're going to have some groups come forward and say, absolutely not, over my dead body. And now you have a war where, had it been done a little bit more adroitly, you could facilitate a conversation that leads people to understanding. So I would say, getting to consensus with a decentralized group without a top-down approach is a very difficult thing to do. And I don't think any government has demonstrated a great ability at doing that. It seems to me in a network society, this is one of the big challenges for the 21st century. We have to find a way to get the input of the group and to get people to align, even if they disagree, to get them aligned on what a solution is. What we have right now is gridlock, unfortunately. It's really hard to push past
And
that.
I don't see any immediate solutions to this. I think we're going to have to get the point of almost systemic collapse or crisis before, unfortunately. Now, I want to just take a little bit of exception to your point, because let's get into this. It is whether or not extreme weather events are costing us more money and costing us more lives, right?
Oh, they are, though. That's for sure true, right?
Right. And if we look at this, if we look at the costs of extreme events attributed to climate change alone, then, there's a great paper on this in Nature, which I can post out on the social channels. We do this. But if you look at the majority of the cost, it's due to human loss of life, right? The largest costs that are attributed in these events. But if you look at the types of extreme weather that are impacting this, then it's sort of across the board. It's not necessarily just as hurricanes. 64% of climate change attributed damages are connected to storms. 16% result from heat waves. Floods and droughts are responsible for 10%, and wildfires, which is a big issue in California, is about 2% of attributed damages. This is over the last. This is 185 climate matched events.
Wow. So fire is less than
researched.
10%, and storms is 60%.
Yeah, and
That's interesting.
cold events are about 2%. Right.
So one of the
extreme
challenges is how we measure these things and how we report and track them. For instance, intensity of storms is a difficult thing to measure, and I don't think there's great consensus on the way it's being measured and explained right now. I don't think there's any question about the economic impact. That's actually a function of inflation and demand, right? So as more people want to move to the coast, as it's seen as desirable to live in these places that are either close to nature, here in California, the urban wildlife interface, right? Building out further into the wilderness, well, that's going to put you in the fire zone. Or you build on the coast, okay, well, now you're in the storm zone, right? So, and then those are desirable properties, so the cost is very high. You're talking about homes that used to cost a few tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now they cost millions of dollars, so the replacement cost is great. Hence, the economic damage is going to be much bigger, even if the storm itself is the same size of impact that it had in the past.
Yeah, the other piece of this Nature article was they said that actually as middle class populations are growing, and as affluent, populations are growing, that also contributes to an increased cost for the same, exactly the same reason.
So we've been talking largely about government and government response and government preparation, but the other aspect is private sector. And then we talk about private sector, you're talking about insurance. And the insurance industry is super interesting. They're one of the few industries that spends an enormous amount of time thinking about the future, right? That's their business. They're in the business of making good bets, smart bets about the future. And there are two types of insurance companies. There's the local insurers, and then there's the global reinsurance companies. So I read a little bit about this today before this call because I thought you'd be interested to hear it.
Sure.
When a private insurance company calculates risk, they look at three factors when we're talking about property damage from a storm. The first one is the hazard, which is the probability of the storm. So what's the likelihood of a storm? And there, the conclusion seems to be that the number of storms may not be changing, but the intensity and the damage is increasing. So that's something you need to pay attention to, and they can calculate that probability pretty accurately with historical data.
Well, listen, before we jump into the insurance thing in detail, why don't we take a break? And then we can come back.
Let's do that. We'll take a little break and come right back.
Jump into the insurance stuff because I've got a bunch of stats I want to get into as well. And if we start getting into that, we're going to
go over too long. All right, folks, you're listening to The Futurists with Rob and Brett. We're talking about extreme weather and the implications of that. We'll be back in just a minute. Stay tuned.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. Welcome back to the Futurists. So just before the break, we were getting into the impact of these extreme weather events and the costs of these extreme weather events on insurers and the ability to insure your home. Rob, you were talking about insurance in California, right?
The big issue here is that insurance companies are pulling out of the state. They decided that there are too many properties built that are exposed to wildfire, and the costs are getting really high for all the reasons we just talked about. The real estate prices are so high, and the properties themselves are expensive. So they're pulling out of the state. And this is not the only state. That's also true in Florida and some of the other Gulf states in the U.S., where insurance companies are pulling out at such a clip that the insurer of last resort, which is usually something that's provided by the state government, these organizations now are running at a deficit, and they may not be able to sustain. Like they may collapse. So there's a sort of systemic issue here, which is that private insurance hasn't seen an incentive to come in and offer insurance. In the states where they're trying to lure them back, like California, the insurers are saying, okay, we will come back, but we want the right to increase our premiums. And the state insurance commissioner, they're resistant to that, of course, but they have to listen. What they're asking for is a 40% increase on premiums. And of course, if the new insurers come in at that rate, then the existing insurers are going to get the same treatment. So that means people will pay 40% more. Now, Brett, my home insurance has increased by 50% every year since the pandemic. So now I'm on track to pay home insurance that is almost the same as my property taxes.
And property tax in California is high, right?
It's relatively good compared to the East Coast, but that's because we pay taxes in 100 other ways that, so
true.
California is very good at collecting taxes. But this is a problem, right? Because if you're thinking about buying a home, now you have to take into account the cost of home ownership. It's not just your mortgage anymore. It's the cost of increasing property tax.
Well, you can't get a mortgage if you don't have insurance, and this is a problem. Florida, since 2017, 10 property and casualty companies have liquidated, but 5 of those were just in 2022 alone, and there's projected another 17 that could go under, just from this current hurricane season. So, this is a tough business. Is a huge issue
to be in. Before the break, I was saying the way insurance companies measure risk is that they look at three factors. And the first one is hazard. The hazard is the probability of a storm or a probability of an extreme event that's going to create a problem. So that's a classic calculation they can use historical data for, but the wild card is, is it getting more intense? That's hard to calculate right now. Second one is exposure, and exposure sounds to us like something is sticking up in the way of the storm. But what the insurers mean by exposure is the actual value. What is the economic value of the property that's being insured? So what's their exposure? And then the third part of risk is vulnerability. And that's a question of how well might the property survive a big storm. So you take these three factors into account: the likelihood of a storm, that's hazard; the expense of the property, the value of the property, that's called exposure; and then how well that property will survive, that's called vulnerability. There are mitigating factors for all of these things. With the hazard, the wild card is if the storm is going to be more intense. That's what everyone's wondering about right now, trying to study. Exposure. The issue here is inflation. Property values have been going up, and they're going to continue to go up. And frankly, real estate as an asset class has been growing much faster than other asset classes for the last 30 years. So the actual amount of property in endangered areas or at-risk areas, that value has gone up a huge amount. So the huge exposure for the insurance companies. That's why they're pulling back from places.
It's not only those costs. If you look at Florida. In terms of why you have all of these losses of insurers there, one of the major impacts is insurance fraud. And so when you have more extreme weather events, unfortunately, it produces a lot more fraud as well. So even though Florida has 9% of the country's home insurance claims, it has 79% of home insurance lawsuits. So, that shows that there's massive, there's all sorts of particular insurance frauds. Things, for example, like, roof repairers or roof replacement companies coming in and finding damage that the homeowner can use to claim to build a new roof and so forth, So unfortunately...
so that's when you say there's lawsuits, it's the insurance company suing claimants.
Correct. For fraud.
I see.
Yeah, for insurance fraud.
That's a huge number.
And contractors and so forth. It's massive, right?
So it's a racket.
We're talking about, let's talk about Hurricane Helene, that just happened a couple of weeks ago. Georgia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Florida. It dumped 20 trillion gallons of water.
Yeah.
This is, you can't expect that infrastructure that was built 100 years ago or even 50 years ago is necessarily going to be able to cope with this type of
and it comes
extremes.
all at once. This is the weird part about it, right? So there's no way to prepare for it. 2 years ago here we had the atmospheric storms. And because of the way my house is situated, I can see the storms coming from the ocean, and you can see it getting closer and closer. And it's like this big black cloud. And as it gets over your house, all of a sudden, the water, it is like a river. Like it's like a flood of water that's pouring off both sides of the house at once. This is when we talk about the weather getting more extreme. This is exactly what we're referring to. As the oceans warm up, the storms tend to speed up, right? So the winds get faster. You had people clocking speeds over 100 miles an hour in the most recent storm as it approached Tampa, this Milton storm. But they also hold more water because when the water is warmer, the storm can carry a lot more water. So that's what you were just referring to a moment ago. This tremendous amount of water that can come pouring down, and it all comes down at one time. So even if you have a pretty robust house, you might find that your roadway or your local sewer or some trees or some electric lines are going to get knocked down and damaged. I noticed in Florida, just with this Milton storm that just occurred, there were a lot of sinkholes. Florida is the sinkhole capital of the country in the first place, but this storm caused additional sinkholes, right? So that's not something you would expect to get from a rainstorm, but apparently it caused that. The other thing that happened related to the wind, there were more than 100 tornadoes in Florida around the storm. So you've got this gigantic storm system moving in, but surrounding it then are dozens of tornadoes, and the tornadoes actually killed quite a few people in this most recent storm, the Milton storm. I think this is unusual. At least anecdotally, certainly seems unusual. Where we had big storms in the past, I don't think we had storms that dropped this much water or came with this much intensity in terms of wind
Well,
power.
I wanted to play just a clip from MSNBC where we have this is from John Morales. He's a meteorologist for Miami's local NBC affiliate, which is NBC 6 South in Florida. And there's an interview from him, and let's just hear what he says about the warming seas in terms of how that impacted Hurricane Milton.
So that news just came out right now, and it's certainly it's just an incredible hurricane. It has dropped 50 millibars in 10 hours. I apologize. This is just horrific. Maximum sustained winds are 160 miles per hour, and it is just gaining strength in the Gulf of Mexico, where you can imagine the winds. I mean, the seas are just so incredibly hot, record hot, as you might imagine. You know what's driving that. I don't need to tell you. Global warming, climate change, leading to this and becoming an increasing threat.
All right, so I don't know whether you noticed that, but he said in that clip it had dropped 50 millibars in 10 hours. And at that was the point when he got quite emotional as a meteorologist, saying how extremely unusual. He said, "I apologize. This is just horrific," but this is one of the factors when we talk about the more extremes. These storms can build bigger, faster because of those warming ocean currents, and there's not really a solution for us cooling these warming ocean currents down.
No, in fact, people have been denying global warming for decades, and the question is, where does that heat go if it tends to go in the ocean? That's where it's stored. It's stored as energy, right? So that heat then becomes energy that fuels storms. It's going to release. It has to release at some point, and that's going to come back on land. That seems like it's a likely. That's going to be likely to be with us for an awfully long time.
We can talk about whether these storms are getting more extreme. We know that they're costing a lot more money. But there must be a vector where the cost of these extreme weather events become unmanageable. And that's why we're seeing these insurance companies collapse. That's why we see insurance premiums going up in places like California and Florida. We know that it's estimated that just from these last two hurricanes that we're going to see at least $100 billion of losses for insurers as a result of this. And if you accumulate those losses over time, as you talk about all of the economic factors, then we're going to get to a point where this is actually going to affect GDP. It's going to affect the national debt. It's going to affect, if you can't get insurance, you can't afford to repair your home. It's going to create, eco refugees within the United States. We're going to have people made homeless by extreme weather events because they can't afford the insurance and so forth. We just need a more coherent plan to deal with this, I would say. I don't want to be a fear monger, but
but I think you're playing out the scenarios right now. It's a reasonable exercise. The people who do this exercise the best in the world are the reinsurers, companies like Munich Re. Now, here's the interesting thing. They're doing quite well. They've been studying climate models for 50 years. Yeah. They've been making this bet. They're the ones that when your insurance company exceeds their threshold, they turn to Munich Re to back them up, right? They're the reinsurer. They're the guarantor, I guess, of those insurance companies.
I spoke to the CEO of Swiss Re. This was in Zurich just after the pandemic. It was about 2022. It was one of the first events I'd done back in Europe after the pandemic as a speaker, and it was with the Swiss Bankers Association, and the CEO of Swiss Re was there. And I said to him, "So how are you guys going to handle this as extreme weather events kick up?" Because I did the Futurist thing, and he said, "We're just stopping insuring property that's going to be affected."
Okay.
You know,
Well
like
then,
he's like we're modeling cities that are going to be impacted by this, and we're just exiting from those markets.
so that means that eventually you'll have properties on probably coastal regions or other endangered regions that'll simply be uninsurable.
Yeah,
And the price will drop to reflect that. People can buy it, but they're going to be at risk and they'll be on their own. The funny thing about people is you can tell them and you can warn them and you can show them a model and you can explain it to them and you can
right.
give them all the data you
Yeah,
want and they're still going to say, yeah, but I want that house by the water. I want to buy a
yeah,
place on the
yeah, yeah,
Carolina coast,
yeah,
even if the
yeah,
sandbar is eroding.
yeah, yeah.
You can't
In
stop them.
so in 2023, we had 28 weather and climate disasters with losses that exceeded $1 billion in the United States. And if you look at let's look at the economics of this. So, Superstorm Sandy, do you remember the estimates of what that cost the US?
No, this is the one that hit New York and flooded the
Yeah.
subways, right? I don't remember
So
the numbers.
it was about $90 billion. So if we look at what it would cost to reinforce Manhattan
Yeah.
from climate, I think the estimates are about 40 billion. So there's already been 900 million invested in climate adaptation for the lower part of Manhattan, and they're saying that over the next 3 years they're going to spend 1.8 billion on that. But let's think about this. They're saying the total cost to protect New York City from climate extremes is 52.6 billion. That's the estimate from the Army Corps of Engineers. But Superstorm Sandy was 90 billion in economic losses.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't just
So-
Manhattan. So it would seem like there's a very strong business case for
Yeah.
climate resilience. But how do you get a $50 billion expenditure passed in the current political environment? That's the
Good
problem.
question. That's
Right?
the problem. But
This is not about, we know how to fix it. It's not the technology. It's not a technology limitation. It's not even, you could argue it's not even an economic limitation, because this is a good investment in the future of the economy in the United States. It's going to create jobs. It's going to it's going to make the infrastructure resilient. So why aren't we spending the money? It comes down purely to politics right now.
political will and vision. Boy, we sure have bad leadership on this front because politicians are weaponizing these topics.
Yeah.
They're scaring people with misinformation. They're telling them things that are factually untrue. In some cases, the opposing political party is actually maligning government's ability to respond or to even help people recover afterwards. So there's a great deal of distrust. They're going the opposite way from consensus. It seems like it's just easier to score political points in a cheap way by politicizing the issue and by splitting the electorate apart. That's not the way to get to consensus about how to move forward. We're
And
going the opposite way.
AI is probably just going to accelerate this. This is why, it's so important that we have a way to deal with, or identify factual inaccuracies, disinformation and misinformation. We were talking about this, the other day when we were recording another show. But it's like when AI gets into the mix of this and supercharges disinformation and misinformation, it's not just hallucinations, it's weaponizing this type of stuff. It seems we're going to get further and further away from consensus building mechanisms.
Yeah, the sort of sad irony there is that AI will also give us the ability to do better forecasting and planning and data analysis and find patterns that we couldn't notice on our own. So it will give us this great tool, but yes, the likelihood of that tool being mismanaged and misused is sadly high. When you have people who deny climate change, as there still are some of those people around and they're very vocal, I think it's useful for them to talk to people in the insurance industry and to talk to people in the military. Because these are two organizations, two kinds of organizations that can't afford to indulge in fantasy. They have to deal with facts because they are on the hook, right? They're the last resort. The insurance companies, they own the cost of it. And for the military, it's all about the capacity to respond. And climate change is an increasingly important factor in decisions about military bases and how to equip them, how to sustain them, whether to keep them or not. Many of the U.S. military bases in the Pacific are at very low level. They're at ocean level or sea level, and that presents a gigantic risk, which they're trying to mitigate. But unfortunately, the measures here are like raise the thing up 16 feet or 20 feet off the ground. Like, okay, not easy to do with an Air Force base. It's
No,
a tall order.
or for old properties that were built pre-flood plains and stuff. When we look at this, one of the arguments that people who are resistant to the concept of anthropogenic climate change, will be that the world used to be much hotter than it was, right? So, if we look at, concentration of greenhouse gases and carbon in the atmosphere, we're at the highest level in at least 800,000 years. And so people say, but 800,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago, the planet was a lot warmer than it is today. So we've had this, it's just a natural cycle. But the thing is, humans didn't live back then. We couldn't live
that's right.
in that environment, and so we're getting to a point, like if you look, if the temperatures go up to 60 degrees Celsius, where do you point, of whatever, that it's unlivable. People will die just being exposed for a few hours to that sort of extreme heat, and as you go for the newsroom,
the planet will be fine. The planet will still be here.
Yes.
The planet will still be going. It's like the people on the planet, not so much. Yeah, that's right. We forget that.
We can talk about we can talk about the potential for extreme weather with climate, but the biggest problem we're facing right now is that if this trend continues that we're seeing, it's going to be largely unaffordable for people to live in homes or live in cities where infrastructure hasn't been made resilient. And we don't have a coordinated plan for changing that. No. Yeah, we have building codes, but that's the newer
in some
properties,
cases,
right?
There's no plan. Like when we spoke a couple of episodes ago about how the Rhine River and the Danube River in Europe, which are some of the most trafficked rivers in the world, and they're critically important avenues for industry to ship goods in and out or materials in and out of the country. Now, every summer, they run dry. Like you can't move a barge down those rivers anymore. I'm not really sure what the plan is for that. I don't know what collective action you can do, like in the way the problem's there. How much do you know about the currents in the Atlantic Ocean, the currents that take the Gulf Stream waters and move them up to, up to the North Sea and beyond? That has a great moderating influence on the weather, particularly the winter weather in Europe. It's what keeps the winters relatively mild, even at that high northern latitude. But now there's speculation that system is breaking down as well, and this could be tragic, like on a colossal scale, if it breaks. Now here I'm at the point of speculation. This is more like in terms of future. We're talking about.
But there are hard facts
scenarios
behind this. I mean, I know we've got to wrap up because we're running out of time. But obviously, I come from Australia, and we have this massive coral die-off happening in Australia right now because of the warming ocean, and that's it's considered one of the modern wonders of the world, the Great Barrier Reef, and we are going to lose it in the next 20 years because of this. We see in the Amazon, we've lost 20% of the Amazon to wildfires and over farming over the last 40 years. If it gets to 25% of the Amazon lost, then we lose what is in common vernacular is called the lungs of the earth, which is not technically correct because probably plankton is that, but at the same time, we're talking about these amazing natural environments that are going to be seriously compromised. That's one side of it. But just on the purely economic impact is people will not be able to afford in climate-adjusted zones like California and Florida and so forth unless we have a plan to make infrastructure resilient. You remember
is there any zone that's exempt from this? It seems to me that the whole West Coast has a fire season from Mexico all the way up to British Columbia and even Alaska now, and it happens almost every summer. We have floods in the Midwest. We have firestorms in Australia. Right now, there's giant firestorms underway in Portugal. So this is not a phenomenon that's limited to 3 U.S. states. It seems to be touching people in different ways, different kinds of weather, but in different parts of the world, in equal measure.
I think maybe the Nordics, have a little bit more resilience there, but only because they're generally net colder. But I see it happening in Thailand at the moment. Big floods there. We've had
Bangkok is at sea level, right? And so that's actually the city's sinking as far as I can tell.
And they've got many plans, and they're bringing in the Dutch to sort of help them build levees and divert rivers and things like that. So they have some plans, but at the same
in Kuala
time,
Lumpur, they're moving the capital city to another place.
Indonesia, they're moving.
It's Jakarta. Okay, that's right. Not Malaysia.
So Jakarta is pretty much doomed. But if you think about this is my real concern. If you think about all of these elements, and the eco refugees, think about food supply when you have massive flooding and salt coming into the farmlands and things like this. Whatever way you look at these numbers, you get to a point where economically, our current system and politically, our current system does not have the tools required to respond to the intensity and extremeness of these changes that are coming. And that's the real problem, because we have the tech to fix this. We can make Floridian homes more resilient, but as you pointed out in the conversation,
and governments can do big projects. Mega infrastructure is possible if it's necessary. We shall see what happens in the future. Yeah, so this conversation is partly about weather, but it's also partly about collective action and the public willpower. And in a sense, trying to get people to engage with these concepts. Most people don't like to think about big storms. We don't want to think about preparing for it. We sure don't want to take money out of our pocket and fix the roof when the weather's nice. So people are resistant to the notion of embracing this and preparing for it. But it is inevitable. It's here. And it seems like we're woefully lacking in the means of galvanizing consensus to do much about it. Gosh, we haven't really progressed much in this conversation today. It seems like another doomer kind of version of the Futurists. We're always striving for positive views. Folks who are listening, we may have gotten some of our facts wrong. We'd be interested to get corrected. If you hear about something, if you know some aspect of this that we got wrong, please do let us know in socials, because we want to make sure we're conveying accurate information. We try our best to do it, but we're not always going to get it right. And we would welcome that feedback.
Look, I think it comes down to sort of one thing, is that we're going to be talking about this a lot more, because as the economic impact of this is occurring. So if you're listening to this, then, there is a role for us all to play in accepting that these changes are coming in our society, and the resistance that we have to change, it becomes untenable at some point because of the cost of human lives and because of the economic impact. And so the best thing that we can all do is talk about the fact that we must change. We must build consensus, and we must take action, and we must move to more sustainable resource management, and move away from fossil fuels and all those sorts of things. Even just purely for economic benefit. The cost of coal and oil as energy producing now is significantly higher than renewable forms. So there's not even an argument economically for keeping using these older methods of generation, for example.
That's true, but the fossil fuel emissions are already in the atmosphere, and so we're going to have these effects play out for many years.
Right, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't transition.
That's true. Well, Brett, always good fun to see you. Thanks for tuning in on your world travels as always, and we'll be back next week, folks,
tonight.
With another
it's like 10 in the evening, so I'm going to go.
So you're in Berlin now, right?
Yeah, I'm in Berlin.
What's the weather like? Is it raining? Is it sunny?
It was 12 degrees Celsius when I got here. It's cool, but it's a nice change from Bangkok, I guess.
Cool. I used to live there. I love that city. It's a fun town. Awesome. Enjoy yourself, and I'll see you again. I'll see you in the future.
We'll see you in the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.